Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Production Value Sphere podcast. I'm wearing a shirt today. And of course, this is being shot from my terrorist hideout in Syria. Although now the terrorists are running the country. So, we should get nicer digs soon. All right, enough about that. I have a great guest with me today, my good friend Jeremy Carl, who's now still affiliated with the Claremont Institute, right?
I am.
um, who wrote a very important book. I interviewed him a first time for the website, having not read the book. And I read the book since, and it's really one of those books that I encourage people to actually read because let's be honest, there are books. If you read the Wikipedia summary, you don't need to read the book. Once you understand the basic argument, you're fine. You agree with it, you don't agree with it, but you're fine. This is a book that deserves actually reading because there are so many examples on nearly every page that will sort of make your hair stand up. So the book is titled The Unprotected Class, and I'm going to let you, Jeremy, tell us what the book is about.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on. It's on the rise of anti-white racism in the United States, so sort of a spicy topic. And in the book, I sort of look at kind of how that has manifested itself in 12 different areas, everything from kind of the entertainment world to housing policy to affirmative action in jobs and things like that. And then I suggest some solutions for it. So that's basically the quick elevator pitch summary of the book.
Very good. Okay. So I'm just gonna ask the questions that a lot of our audience may be asking, and the first question, the most obvious one, has to do with the framing of the book, right? Because people don't like to hear the word anti-white. They don't like to hear the word white,
Right.
and so they would say yes, discrimination is bad, but do we have to frame it as something that's anti-white? And so an example, for example, would be college admissions, right? College admissions, assuming bracketing the Supreme Court decision, which universities may or may not be abiding by.
Right.
Um, but sort of affirmative action, people could say, well, it's seeking to help some people, and sort of arithmetically, it ends up disadvantaging other people, which includes whites, but not only whites, also Asians, also Jews, also et cetera, et cetera. And so, why does it help to call something like this anti-white, for example?
Sure, and that's a great question, and I'm glad that you sort of mentioned not only do people not like to say anti-white, they don't like to say white, and that was really honestly part of the reason I wrote the book because we need to talk about these things. I mean, it's a little bit like back in your own country when the before there was the national rally, it was the national front. You know, people needed to actually raise the issues before you can
Right.
get any movement on it, right? So that's just and then people are going to call you lots of names when you do that, but eventually, hopefully, over time, you win. So, particularly sort of boomer aged folks are very uncomfortable when you use the word white, and I mean, I've seen that. Um, they want to kind of talk about anything else, or even they'll frame the discrimination in some other way. But that's really why we need to talk about it because that's what it's been going on. And in fact, Steve Saylor has talked about kind of anti-whiteness as the KKK crazy glue that holds the other coalition together. I mean, it's really the only thing they sort of have in common. And so, while I might wish that it were otherwise, I think it's really important that we're honest. Now, having said that, you did raise an important point, and I do make this distinction in the book. There are plenty of policies in the U.S that are particularly targeted as anti-white, and you talk about them that way. There are other policies that are simply anti-merit, in which whites get caught up in them. And you touched on affirmative action in uh, the college admission process, and that is definitely one example of that. Now, that doesn't make it any less nefarious, but I do think that we always need to make a distinction between actual policies and procedures that are targeted at whites and policies that just have whites get swept up in them, because also for those second group of policies, there are potential coalitions to be made that look at the other groups that are being affected by it, in this case Asian Americans in college admissions. So I do think it's a useful distinction, but at the same time I think it's really important to also call a spade a spade.
Okay, so you said there are some policies that are definitely anti-white. What are they?
Sure. Well, I mean, you have a lot of fellowships and things like that where you'll
Right,
literally see it'll be like, this is for BIPOC people, which is Black, Indigenous people of color, or
right.
um,
It's
we're
basically like anybody except white people,
yeah,
right?
right. And they never frame it that way, which is why it's
Right.
important to say actually what you're
That
doing is you have
that's
a
a very
fellowship.
good point, actually. Right?
Yeah,
They say it without saying it, which is why it's important to say it. Okay,
right.
fair
So
enough. Yeah,
it's
sorry for
important.
interrupting.
No, 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 not at all. I mean, that's why it is important to say it. So you have these sorts of things going on in a lot of the more informal ways. I mean, with things in health, I document a lot of things in that chapter where you literally have white people being put at the bottom of a racial hierarchy for treatment of various types, allegedly because they've received some historical advantage for
Okay,
treatment.
but like be specific. Like
Um,
where you
so one example of this, and again, it'll be a little controversial on the right, not controversial on the right, but I mean, not everybody on the right for obvious reasons will want it. But with vaccine priorities for COVID,
right, yes, that would I
you had
forgot about
several
that.
states, including my own, actually, in which if you were
And
white,
but
you were
and for the viewers, you don't exactly live in a blue state.
no, I do not. I live in Montana, right? So, again, I mean, people have different views on whether you should have taken a COVID vaccine at all. And I'm not trying to adjudicate that here. I'm just pointing out that the government thought that this was a
Right.
desirable
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
And in doing that, they had explicit policies in some states where if you were a white 60-year-old, you were behind an African American 40-year-old
Yes.
or an Asian American 40-year-old in priority. So
Yes,
you have,
and yeah, and just to be clear about that, and thank you for reminding me. And this is why people should read your book, because it's all this stuff. You read it on Twitter and you get angry for like a second and then you forget about it. And it's good to sort of like remember, like I had completely forgotten about this, but it's really a thing that they did. Like they created a racial priority list,
yeah.
and it wasn't just racial with whites at the bottom. It wasn't just racial. It
Yeah.
didn't take into account age.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was just completely at odds with medical need, because again, as assuming that the vaccines do something, which I believe they do, certainly if you're an elderly person,
Right.
um, you need it. You can make the debate about other people, but certainly the elderly needed it, and
Right.
of course the elderly in the U.S. are disproportionately white. So yes, that's a very good example. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so you have that example. You have things in Hollywood again, and I use that maybe because there's a little more informal things going on. So both in informal ways, you now have requirements for the Academy Awards that not a lot of people know about, that basically require certain numbers of diversity points. It's very very complicated system, but basically like anti-white quotas are put in to who you need to have in your production staff and your stars, et cetera, to be
Wow.
considered. So that's thing one. But then, even sort of slightly more informally, you have either color conscious or color blind casting going on. And whether you have color conscious or color blind casting basically depends on um, which system advantages minorities, which is to say, because I think we need to be whenever you talk about advantaging minorities or any group, you're talking about disadvantaging some other groups, and in this case,
Yes.
white Americans. So you can have, the Asian Joan of Arc in actress in
Right.
theory. I mean, that hasn't yet, thankfully, happened in France, but we've had similar things with like Black Anne Boleyn in UK dramas. But essentially, non-white actors playing roles that just were historical roles
Yes.
that as a matter of being faithful to history would have only been a white person, and that's fine. but so you're colorblind in that sense.
Yeah.
But then in other areas, you can be very color conscious when it comes to sort of having quotas to make sure that there are fewer white Americans or cast in something. So these can go on and on. And again, as I'm glad you pointed out, I mean, this is why to read the book is there are sort of hundreds of these examples, and I try
Yeah.
to gather those in a very
Yeah,
specific
and
way.
it's very well documented. It's all footnoted and stuff.
Yeah,
Okay, so there it's good that you go there because there's like two buckets. There's legal stuff and then there's the rest. And on legal stuff, everybody can agree that racial discrimination in law is bad and that we shouldn't have it and so on and so forth. Certainly everybody on the right agrees, and large numbers, maybe not large numbers, but some people on the left, let's put it that way, some people on the left do agree with that, and certainly large numbers of Americans and American voters agree with that, of every race, which is important to point out.
sure.
um, and then there's the softer stuff. There's the stuff that's not written in law. So casting in Hollywood is a good example because, uh, things like Anne Boleyn, okay, but if you're casting the lead of some action movie,
Yeah,
who's to say that they went with a black guy because they're anti-white, right? They might
right,
they might just have thought that so and so is the best actor.
right.
Um, I guess I have two questions, which is number one, so because it's sort of nebulous, how real is it? And how should we talk about it?
Well, it's very real. And again, I mean, that's really what I've tried to document in the book, that these are going on. And you can get people to, in these sort of more nebulous cases, to talk about it quite overtly in a very general way. But then if you might try to pin them down on a specific example, they might say, oh, no, no, we just did that particular one for
Yeah.
merit.
Yeah.
But in general, of course, they're discriminating left and right. And then again, I think the importance of talking about it is that you can't address the problem until you acknowledge the problem actually exists and is out there. So, that's why we need to talk about it, and how we talk about it. Again, the book, I very consciously, this is, I mean, the most edgelordy edgelord will actually learn things from this book that they did not know. But I did not write this book for the most edgelordy edgelord. I wrote it for to have a book that they could, of course, read and profit from, but also that they could give to their mom or dad or their
Right.
friend who is maybe a little skeptical, who's like maybe a little scared of even seeing white in a title, who's not convinced, and to get a very dispassionate, very even-handed, very just the facts, ma'am, without a lot of personal rancor or anger or trying to attack any groups in society, documentation of what's going on. And so that was, why to talk about it, but also how to talk about it. These are controversial issues. They touch it like sort of core issues of identity. I'm not trying to create new problems. I talk in the book about that. I'm not trying to create new victim groups, but I do think at the same time we need to be honest about what's going on so that we can correct course.
Okay. So can you give us other examples of this sort of um, more diffuse discrimination, anti-whiteness?
Yeah, well, I mean, so gosh, now I have to just go back and think about everything in the book, but you have areas like real estate, which is kind of probably the most controversial chapter of my
Okay.
book, where I basically argue that um, white flight from the cities
Right.
in America that began in the 1960s, more or less, is the only form of ethnic cleansing in which the victims were blamed. Um,
Yes.
and again, this is kind of an inversion of the traditional narrative, but I sort of show throughout the book, and this is that it wasn't a question of like, oh, people were really, I don't want to live next to this person because they're the wrong color. I mean, of course, that sort of thing did happen. I'm not naive to that. But in a lot of cases, people stuck around, people tried to make it work in these places, and they were driven out because of crime, violence, often racially targeted violence. And that while this narrative I mean, the ultimate facts of what went on are not really disputed, but the ability of people to even talk about that, to tell their narrative, to put that into a coherent narrative, which we um, talk about, are is sort of not allowed. They weren't. There's almost not allowed to tell these stories. You're just beginning to get now some of the first accounts of like folks who left these areas because it just was no longer tenable. There's a book called Untenable by Jack Cashel that came out a few years ago about his family in Newark, New Jersey, where this sort of thing happened. Jack Posobiec can tell you his own experiences at a later date than when most of this happened, but sort of growing up in Norristown, Pennsylvania, and eventually his family being forced to flee because it ultimately wasn't safe. But again, in the way that America told this narrative, it was all these, evil white racist people, and not, people who were ultimately victimized, who lost the opportunity to get home equity that saw that disappear, all sorts of things. So you have those sorts of things going on as kind of in the background of American society.
Okay, so I mean that's true, and sadly, there's a equivalent in France.
Yeah,
The banlieue in France is a term that's become synonymous for sort of crime and no go zones, but they used to be, working class white,
yeah,
or if there were immigrants, there were immigrants from places like Spain and Portugal
yeah,
that were perfectly, very nice places. And of course, there's a notorious Frenchman who grew up in one of these. It's Eric Zemmour, who,
yeah,
goes on and on about how, when he was growing up, his family was poor, but nobody locked their doors.
yeah,
Kids were playing soccer in the streets, and all of that. And the sort of the French white working class got pushed out
right,
to the exurb, and so
yeah,
the structure of the French city now is like a very wealthy center,
yeah,
and then surrounded by these crime, quote unquote, ghettos. Although the term ghetto, I mean, is one that, because the implication of the term ghetto is that you're forcing people to live there,
right,
but it's the other way
right,
around. It becomes a ghetto once people exercise their rights
yeah,
to no longer live there because those places have been destroyed. And then further back, you have poor white people who don't have access to transport, who therefore must drive, which in France
yeah.
is very expensive.
Yeah. Well,
Okay, so
let me just jump in really quickly. I don't want to get us too far afield, but I am somewhat familiar with the French example as well, although obviously not personally in the way that you are. I'd say a couple differences. One that just made the U.S. crazier. At least in France, it was sort of like the outer boroughs. In the
right,
U.S., it was a lot of
right,
the most prime center
right,
real estate. In fact, as an American, when you go to France, or particularly to Paris, it's always sort of this shock that it's like the very inner city, which would have been the kind of
right. Yes,
dangerous part in the U.S., is still nice, which is of course how things should work in theory. I mean, if you have to have a bad part, you would expect it to be
right.
sort of further away from all the nice things in the center. Um, Secondly, I had 5 years ago when I was in Paris, I took my one of my sons who's kind of very into Christian kind of heroism to the grave of Charles Martel, and
Oh
we
wow.
had the ironic experience, of course, of walking through this area of the guy who kind of drove out the Muslims from Spain, from France, and going through. You're laughing because but we're going through this hugely Muslim area to do
Oh
this,
my
right? I'm
god.
not, of course, suggesting that we should kick out the Muslims from France or anywhere else, but it was just a um, ironic comment
Yeah.
on the development of French society and culture, that to kind of go celebrate this kind of hero of Christendom, I had to walk through the thing that he supposedly had conquered and kept out, but maybe just for a time.
Yeah. Okay, so white flight, very good point. Although, I mean, you can make an argument that that was driven by policy, right? Because
Right.
the crime was enforced and prosecuted and punished changed.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were disparities in policing, although
Yeah.
I mean, I say I'm sure, I don't know actually.
Yeah.
But okay, but you could say, okay, that was tragic, that was horrible, but that was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Very difficult time.
Yeah.
Civil rights were sort of, we didn't know what we're doing.
Right. Right.
It very sad, but it's in the past. What about now?
Yeah. Well, by the way, speaking of it being in the past, I do think it's interesting because there are a lot of people who wrote books with more moderate conclusions who actually, I think, are unnecessarily harsh on the civil rights movement in of itself. And I think maybe just as a person who was a history major in college, at least, I am always a little bit cautious about that for the reasons that you were sort of alluding to, I think, in that, I'm careful to say in the book, look, it's not that we had some sort of perfect system before civil rights came along and everything was hunky
Right,
dory and then we just
right,
messed it up. I mean, the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act, all these things are responding to real problems that we have, and they were sort of blunt instruments to address that. And I think it is fair to say that over the long term, at least, the negative consequences of that began to pile up and become much larger than any positive benefits. But there were short term problems that were solved by doing things in the way that he did. And I try again, and I think this sort of helps when I'm sort of talking to more moderate people and also older people, because like as soon as you criticize the Civil Rights Act, they're sort of out. They don't listen to anything else
right.
you're saying, right? So I think it's important, and I try to do say, no, like I understand why we put in these things. I'm not saying that everything was important, great beforehand, but we have to also look at where we are now as a result of some of that and say, hey, maybe it's time for a change in policy direction, that the problems of 60 plus years down the road are not the same as the problems that we were facing back then.
Yeah. So I was speaking some recently to a friend who's an executive at a big tech company, and we were talking about whatever, something the Trump administration said or did about DEI, and he denied. And this is he's a white man. He denied that DEI has anything to do with discrimination. um, and he said, "Look, the only thing they ever told me is, you have to broaden the pipeline of who you try to recruit, but I
Yeah,
I was never instructed to have a quota or to
yeah,
say or to be biased in any way in who I recruit." And what they said is DI is about expanding the pipeline of people who apply for these jobs, which
right,
sounds very nice.
right,
And he certainly seemed sincere when he was telling me this. I was sort of biting my lip throughout. Um, One of the problems is these things are so hard to prove, partly
yeah,
for legal, people mask them partly for legal reasons, partly for
yeah,
PR reasons. What, how would you describe the reality
right,
um of what's going on with sort of racial discrimination in hiring in like big American
yeah.
companies?
Well, again, I have some specific examples of this in my book, and what I'd say is it's totally possible that what your friend is documenting might be real at his particular company, right? I think it is heterogeneous, both because in some places HR might be a little conservative and more savvy about not doing things that are likely to, frankly, run afoul of existing law, even though lots of companies are in fact doing those things. Um, but they also are in a situation where different groups pursue this with different levels of eagerness. But there's actually a number of lawsuits ongoing, including against Google, um, where people are documenting that they were basically told, "Do not bring in white men for this interview," or "We are
Right.
not hiring white men for these positions." um, as a formal matter of HR policy, right? And so these are actually they've gotten very little publicity, but these are actually being adjudicated in the courts. And the people who are, by the way, making these claims are in most cases people who worked in HR at these companies, right? So they said this is what I was told to do,
Right.
right? So that is not. I mean, we can have an interesting debate about whether even quote unquote broadening the pipeline doesn't run afoul of discrimination laws in some respect. But I think we can all agree that the idea that we would expand our search maybe to some non-traditional groups is certainly a lot less toxic and dangerous than a don't hire white guys approach. And then you also see this in different ways in the way that the H-1B visa debate sort of flared up in the United States. And these are sort of this uh, somewhat skilled, not top guys, but reasonably desirable tech engineers, and 90% of them are coming from India, literally. And Look, I mean, I've lived in
Yeah.
India, so I'm familiar with it. I'm familiar with these companies. This is not because 90% of the people who are qualified for these
Right.
jobs are from India. It is because the companies that are running this are overwhelmingly these Indian companies, and they're engaging in ethnic nepotism, which, by the way, happens a lot among Indians in Silicon Valley. And again, is sort of talked about in hushed whispers. So we're not sort of having a free and open global competition to bring in really
Right.
good engineers. We're having a racialized and nationalized competition. So these things, these examples of overt discrimination are actually out there.
Yeah. Okay, let's okay, I want to address a sort of very difficult topic. And I want to do it sort of intelligently without, certainly without being coy, but also without being alarmist, which is the topic of anti-white propaganda in media. And I
Yeah,
mean, I'm sure you've seen this new Netflix show, Adolescence,
right.
um, which is for people who don't know, it's this show that was produced by Netflix with apparently some British government money, and and the real story that it's based on is this African immigrant 13-year-old boy who stabbed a girl in his school. And the Netflix version, they're literally doing the meme.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's a white boy who was radicalized by Andrew Tate and the
Right,
Manosphere.
right.
And that's sort of a very egregious example. Another famous example is there's this social media account and these compilations on YouTube of like white men being stupid in commercials.
Yes.
The commercials, for some reason, are sort of extremely. Um, and this is one place where France is not immune. The only time I watch TV is for sports events. I
Yeah.
follow rugby and I follow Formula One, very European sports. So that's when I watch the idiot box, and I'm always because every single ad includes a racial lie. Every
Yeah.
single ad includes a sort of absurd. There's so in France you have to buy insurance for your kids when they go to school, because you're personally liable for anything your child does, and so if your child breaks something, you have to pay for it, and so you have to buy insurance. And so in the ad for that kind of insurance, it's an Asian girl who keeps like breaking things
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, of course.
which is I mean, it's like what's the least plausible, it's not
Right.
just like, oh, let's not make it the obvious thing, which okay, but it's like let's pick the least plausible and
Yeah.
those ads are interspersed with ads for home security systems, which are all over everywhere. For some reason there were no ads for home security systems in France when I was growing up. Like, what happened?
Yeah.
And I posed this question on Twitter, and somebody literally replied, "Well, people are buying home security systems because of right wing propaganda about immigrant crime."
Yeah.
And of course, in those ads, the burglars are. There's a famous ad where the burglar is an old white guy,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like a 60-year-old white guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so anyway, you know, it's where you get into this sort of weird stuff and the sort of like, am I crazy stuff? Like, I don't want to become the kind of person who
Right.
says the words anti-white propaganda. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Like, but at the same time, at some point, you have to believe what your eyes say. Like, I mean,
Right.
the case of adolescence. And now the British government wants to show it in school. Like, it's clearly like propaganda that's
Yeah.
aimed at white males, that's
Yeah.
aimed at portraying white males as demonic. And the show makes a point of showing that the kid has, like, a good family and all of that. There's no reason for his motive.
Yeah.
There's no motive for his crime other than him being a white male.
Yeah.
So anyway, I've been ranting. How should people? First of all, is it real? And to what extent? And how should people think about this? How should people talk about this?
Yeah. Well, it is very real. I mean, I'll go further. I mean, you say anti-white propaganda. I mean, I've called it blood libels against white people, which is really what it is.
I mean,
And
in the case of something like adolescence, it's absolutely what it is. Yeah.
and again, I mean, you're the discomfort that you have, which, by the way, even I have. Like, for many reasons, I didn't want to write this book. Okay, practical, but also I have been propagandized to feel icky about. I get the
And
ick,
that's not
right?
necessarily a bad thing, right?
Right.
But
No, 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 of course. I mean, right. I think it's an interesting question, right? Like, is it a bad thing or not? I mean, it's certainly a good thing that we should not leap to exacerbate racial animosities. Okay. I mean, I think there's no disputing of that. I think the question is, and I'm probably a little skeptical, was all the push that was done for this through the media, was it done because they were saying, hey, it's really bad to um, exacerbate racial animosities, or was it something more nefarious? Was it really sort of anti-white in its intention, in its origins? Um, but I think that's what's going on. Again, I have many examples of this in the book. I talk about white men are stupid in commercials. There's all sorts of interesting racial propaganda going on in some of these commercials, and in fact, some of it documented by African American scholars who I cite in the book. But you do have these things, um, and again, I understand why we don't want to reinforce stereotypes in the other direction, but at a certain point, it really does cross the line, especially when you're being exposed to this in school with your kids, of being propaganda and not anything less than that, and that becomes a huge problem, obviously. So I think we do need to just have the courage to see what's in front of our face and call it out and say that it's not acceptable.
okay, so do we need a NAACP for white people? Do
Well,
we?
yeah. I mean, I think the first things we need to do are a lot of the things that the Trump administration is thankfully doing, right? Which is just getting rid of some of these more notorious laws, and they've even gone back and gone as far as Lyndon Baines Johnson from the 1960s and repealing the federal affirmative action order. Now, having said that, uh, seeing and doing are different things. And one of the predictions that was maybe not obvious to some people that I'm sad that I got completely correct was, I said, when we had this very good Supreme Court affirmative action decision that came down that said you can't discriminate against students on the basis of race for college admissions, and that impacts predominantly whites and Asian Americans, that in fact universities would ignore that. And we had some data that was just shown on the New York Times a few months ago, about how this looked generally. But then more recently, we had a NYU, New York University, a fairly prestigious school, had their admission system hacked, and it was shown that you still had
That was
these
really
enormous
funny.
disparities in test scores between different ethnic and racial groups, which in theory should be totally banned by this sort of a ruling. Now, in reality, I mean, you were never going to fully get this. One of the reasons you were never going to get full non discrimination is because the numbers would then become so racially skewed that they just would not be palatable um, politically. But there would be a number of at least intermediate steps where at least you could have had a fig leaf over it and you would have had some substantial changes in demographics, and at least the admissions would have been much closer. But what's basically happened is the schools have essentially thumbed their nose at the Supreme Court, and I think it's up to the Trump administration to really crack down here and enforce the law. And I'm hoping that they're going to do that over time. I mean, Harmeet Dillon, who's going to be running civil rights at the DOJ, is, I think, both a sharp. She's still waiting on final confirmation, but that's going to happen. I mean, I think she's a sharp and strategic actor, and so I'm optimistic that she's going to move there. As far as civil rights, do we need an NAAWP? Right? I don't know that it needs to get to that, but I do think it was really important that white people be comfortable in talking about this. And in fact, one of the interesting things I had in just writing this book that I think makes it very relevant is when I told people I was going to do this, those who didn't just kind of warn me away from it point blank would sort of say, "Hey, it's great that you're writing this book, but it would be really great if a minority wrote this book." Ironically, the name most mentioned to me at the time, this was obviously a few years ago, was Candace Owens, a nice non-controversial, but this was like mainstream Candace Owens, right?
Same book, but just the final chapter about how it's all the Jews.
Right, right, exactly. But yeah, so but what I said is, I think part of the problem here is we've got to make it okay for white people to defend white people. Like it can't just be a sort of thing where we get only minorities are allowed to say these things. I mean, I'm glad when minorities do say these things, and I think I salute them. I'm happy to have them as allies. I think it's great. It's 5 stars to them, but we can't simply rely on that and not be willing to make our own case without
Right.
apology. And so that was again, partially why I wrote the book. And again, does this need an NAAWP? I don't necessarily think so, but do we need to have groups that are unapologetically advocating? I do think that, and I think it's revealing that in order to appeal to a Supreme Court that had 5 white conservative justices and then an African American justice who's probably the most conservative, but the plaintiffs, excuse me, that were used for the affirmative action case were Asian Americans and not white Americans. And at a trivial
Right.
level, you can say, well, the score disparities were even bigger for Asian Americans, and that's why they want to do it. That's a little bit true. I think there's something to that, but I think that was not really what drove it. What
Yeah.
drove it was they recognized, the attorneys correctly, that the white boomers on the Supreme Court were going to be very uncomfortable, doing anything that looked like they were advantaging white people. And so by having Asian American plaintiffs, it would sort of be more comfortable for everybody. And I understand that, points to them, it was the right legal strategy, but at the same time, like that's the type of attitude that I want to get rid of.
I, fair enough. Okay, so the last time you and I had a conversation about this, it was before the election.
Yeah.
Since then, there's been an election. There's the president has taken office, and I just have two thoughts about this. One is about the election itself, and so because Trump won unprecedented numbers of minorities, and it was and DEI was like an important topic in the campaign. Like it wasn't just like, something that was like on the list
Yeah.
but that people didn't talk about. And it was a sort of, as the kids say, a white pill.
Yeah.
But it was joking aside, it was there was something very beautiful and powerful about this multiracial coalition of Americans saying,
Yeah.
no, that I don't want my country to be run like this. I don't want my
Right.
country to be run based on a racial spoils system. I want the fair rules the same for everybody. Um, you know, isn't that isn't that better than talking about anti-white racism? I mean, I'm phrasing the question somewhat provocatively, but
Yeah. No,
you
this
you
is
get at
great.
what I'm saying? Like things are improving,
Yeah.
and it's not just white people and and a few Asians who do really well on the ACTs
Right.
who are opposed to this. It's actually the majority of Americans of every race because they believe
Yeah.
in the fairness and the justice of the American system.
Yeah.
And therefore, shouldn't we bank the win and just keep talking about fairness and race neutrality
Yeah.
and stop talking about white people?
Yeah. Great question. And there's a lot to unpack within it. And I mean, let me just obviously say at a trivial level, but I think it's important to say it's great that we had a more multiracial coalition, right? Like, I'm glad it's good on 50 different levels, right? I'm delighted that we did better among minorities. I think it's also notable that um, Trump, while not maybe talking explicitly about anti-white racism, got that multiracial coalition with some of the more provocative rhetoric on race that you have seen from an American presidential candidate over decades, right? So
True.
I think, there were, I was, remember being back in the post 2012 election moratorium and having to fight against the GOP post-mortem that said, actually what we really need to do is just cuck on immigration and
Yeah.
effectively sell out white people left and right, and that's the only way we can win in a multicultural America. And people like me made the argument not only that just minorities were not necessarily as in favor of open borders as you might think, which I think is true, um,
Oh
but
yeah.
that when you show that kind of weakness and patheticness and unwillingness to stand up for yourself. It's like, again, it's I can't believe I'm using the phrase "get the ick" twice. Maybe it's because we had that interesting manosphere uh, discussion on X that is making me think of this. But like, voters get the ick. They look at you and you're like, who is this clown who doesn't respect themselves enough? And I think
Right.
when
That's
white people
interesting.
respect themselves enough to be proud of this country, be proud of its heritage, um, and to not apologize for themselves, voters of all races actually respond very positively to that, especially if you are inviting them in to be part of the club, right? Which is, of course, the second element of that. I think it's a much stronger and better way. And I think in many ways that's almost the core of Trump's appeal is um, it's pure Americanism. Now, there's a lot of implicit white coding in that, but it's always very clear that that can expand to people from any background. That Trump is
Right.
out there at UFC or whatever, and he's hugging whoever from any background. It's very explicit, and so I think again, people react very positively to that. I don't think it's neither or. Having said that, I think a little bit of the black pill, and this is where I disagree. There's some people who say, well, this is the future multiracial coalition. I'd say a few things. One is, look, we still overwhelmingly won white voters and we still lost every minority group. I mean, we did a
Right.
lot better, right? We got 13% among African Americans and a much better number among, say, young African American men. We took 46% of Hispanics and 40% of Asian Americans. These exit polls kind of move around a little bit, but there's that's the best data we seem to have right now. But those are all still losing numbers, right? If you add more and more to that, you're still going to lose. I also think that for some of these groups, when some of the anti-white policies that Trump is enacting or getting rid of actually begin to take effect, there will be pressure on that multi-ethnic coalition. It's one of the reasons I'm not quite as sanguine as some people that it's just arrow go up, up, up. I do think that on things like immigration, if you really start deporting mass deportations in ways that might say disproportionately affect the Hispanic community, it's essential that you do that no matter what community it's affecting, but it's going to affect your popularity there. If you really stop giving racially preferential hiring to some of these groups, again, like people say in theory, oh, I'm for equal treatment, but when they actually see equal treatment, they may be a little less for it. I don't think these are unsolvable problems. I don't think that the GOP is absolutely doomed in these areas. Actually, one of the things that I really call for in the book is this idea of almost multiracial whiteness, not my own term, but I think it may even kind of emerge from Eric Kaufman, who's himself a multiracial scholar over in the UK. But this kind of notion that as we're creating this new American ethnogenesis, if you encourage minorities or people with some minority ancestry, but also some white ancestry, if you encourage them to identify with this new American
Right.
majority and you don't penalize them for doing that because it's like, oh, well,
Right.
no longer you're in this group that's getting bennies, that they'll actually do that. Because people want to be part of the winning team. They want to be part of the history and legacy of the country. And so I do think that there's opportunities to do that. But I do think that perhaps we will have some retrenchment among minority voters. And where it really stands out, and again, I've written about this elsewhere, that Trump has not done as well is actually among white voters. And given the amount of institutional hostility of the Democratic Party to white voters, how poorly we've done among particularly post grad educated white voters is sort of shocking. I mean, when you have the Democrat Party, I think, again, of the first 2 years of the Biden judicial selections, you had 22 African American women selected as judges and 5 white men. Over time, if we're talking about that in the right way, this has got to repel elite whites. I mean, this is really, really bad for them personally. There's no future for them in a party that treats them like that. So I do think that the future for the GOP is perhaps a little whiter or white oriented than some of the multiracial working class coalition folks would like to admit. But at the same time, of course, we welcome a broad as possible coalition and we want people to join that.
Yeah, I want to get back to the idea of multiracial whiteness because I think it's fascinating. But before, my other question about Trump. So, I wrote a piece yesterday about Colombia, which I think you like. But what's happening between the administration and Colombia is the sort of flashpoint for all of this stuff. And it's attacking Colombia for aiding and abetting anti-Semitism, which is
Yeah.
totally good, like extremely good, because it's absolutely true that they did
Yeah.
that, and it's monstrous, and
Right.
there are also probably reasons related, legal reasons related to all sorts of provisions of support for terrorism and so on and so
Yeah.
forth, because it's related to Hamas and October 7th. But um, one of the things you said at the time, I'm misremembering a tweet of yours, so correct me, because it's a low production values podcast, so we don't do our homework. But essentially, you said, attacking anti-Semitism in Colombia, great, wonderful, but
Yeah.
Colombia also has a lot of anti-white initiatives. When is the
Yeah.
administration going to get on that? And I thought that was an excellent point. So I get, beyond the question of what of Colombia itself. Like, do you think the Trump administration should explicitly call out anti-white, academic programs or whatever,
Yeah.
whatever, and sort of seek to prosecute or withdraw funding or whatever. I mean, you understand the question I'm asking.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, I do. And I think what I've kind of urged, because there's sort of these two unhelpful poles of kind of views, and I think the mainstream conservative view on this is right, which is what you just articulated and what I would support, which is yes, we should go there. But there's some people, on the kind of furthest reaches of the right who are like, it's just these perfidious Jews, and they're the only people who are gonna ever get protection from this, and they're terrible. And I think Chris Rufo had a piece just the other day, and he's made this point a number of times, which is like these people largely, I mean, there's more going on because it's complicated Middle East, et cetera. Jews are being coded as white, and therefore they're bad, and that's why they're
Yes,
being
it's
attacked,
absolutely true.
right? And so we
In the
should,
West, that's what's happening.
right? So we should welcome that. Like, I mean, not we don't welcome the attacks, but we should welcome like that type of framing of the issue, because A, it's accurate, and B, that's um, what's going on, and the kind of you know
This
extremely
is like a
far right.
Jewish joke, by the way, which it's like I mean, yeah, it's like, oh, Jews have finally succeeded at becoming white. Oh, and
Right.
by the way, it turns out that being white in 2025 means that Muslims still want to kill you or
Right,
something.
right, right. Right. It's just like we need to avoid this retarded Nick Fuentes like coded thing where
Right.
we somehow like these pro-Palestinian forces are universally just like anti-white, anti-Western. It's okay to oppose them, like just for that. And I like it because I do think it puts down a marker, and then especially if we show, hey, we're good in coalition here, like let's expand that even further, and say like we're going to go after explicitly anti-white things, period. And I think that there is plenty of room to do that. By the way, you are seeing this internationally, right? um, Marco Rubio explicitly calling out the
Yes.
anti-white racism of the South
Yes.
African government, right? So there's also a certain amount of willful denialism among some of the people on the farthest right. They say, oh, well, this isn't going on. No, the Trump administration is calling out anti-whiteness very explicitly, and I'd like to just continue to see more of that. Um, and I'm going to kind of gently prod if I feel like, wow, we're focusing too much here on Jews and not on anybody else. But I don't want it to be a negative thing. I think it's great that we're going after these people. They're bad folks, and they're anti-white, they're anti-Semitic, etc., and we want them out of the country. So I think it's overall a win and a good precedent to set. We shouldn't become sort of our own enemies on this. And I'm optimistic and confident, just based on the personnel I know in the Trump administration, that this category is going to continue to expand in ways that we will like, if we just let it.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good to hear. Okay, so let's go back to this concept of multiracial whiteness, because I think it's very fascinating, and as of course I myself am Latinx, I'm very interested, because the French are brown or even arguably black. So um no, but like, explain the concept, explain why you think it's interesting, and I
Yeah.
think it's very interesting because it sort of points a way forward to racial reconciliation that's
Yeah.
not fake.
Right.
um
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's so multiracial whiteness. I mean, that's kind of the fun way to talk about it. The more maybe slightly academic and less provocative way would be to say that you're just trying to do a new American ethnogenesis. You're trying to create a new unified American identity, and the most radical, and like to do that, we don't need to have a genetic test to like figure out where every single one of your ancestors was in 1776. We can just say like, hey, do you really like George Washington? Do you identify with the founders, et cetera, et cetera? Then you're kind of on Team America. And the sort of most extreme example, one I refer to in the book, of how this doesn't necessarily need to be tied to any specific genetic relation is that if you go to Hungary, they have this sort of deep cultural um, identification with the Central Asians who kind of came in, brought their language, which is totally unrelated to any other European language except for, I think, slightly Finnish, brought certain elements of culture. They sort of identify themselves very uniquely with these kind of steppe barbarians who came
Yeah, the
in.
Magyar.
I thought the Magyar, yeah, who 1,000 years ago then are eventually Christianized. Um, when you do a genetic test of the Hungarians, they basically look pretty much just like all the other Central European groups around them. I'm getting this from Razib Khan, who's an interesting kind of right wing geneticist. You probably know Razib.
Shocking.
Uh, yeah, but the interesting thing is, so the reason why this happened is basically this Central Asian elite is kind of wiped out fighting the Turks in the 1300s, and so they sort of disappear from the genetic signature, but the cultural and linguistic heritage, et cetera, is still
That's
there.
fascinating.
So that's, I mean, the extreme example. That's not going to happen. We're not going to have an America which is like 0% historically ethnically European that is somehow I mean, that's just, it's not going to happen. But you could have this very multiracial grouping of people. For example, about a third of Hispanics, which is already a group that is predominantly of European origin, like 4 times more that on average than anything else. A third of them are already intermarrying with white
Right.
non-Hispanic. That's going to increase over time, presumably. And again, if you're not offering them incentives to say, hey, I'm
Right.
actually this other thing, which is not white, they're going to want to identify as like with the American majority. And you're seeing this with like these third generation English speaking Latinos who are very pro Trump, right? Like that's to some
Yeah.
degree
Yeah.
an element of that
And
phenomenon. But it's not
yeah.
just them. It's Eurasians. You can imagine any number of mixed groups that, if we create the right sort of incentives, are going to identify with the historic American majority and culture. And I think that's a great thing. I mean, this is sort of, some people call this castizo nationalism or whatever, but I think this is good. I think it needs to be combined with closing the border because you don't want to exacerbate the hyperdiversity problems that you have. But I think if you close the border and allow that American ethnogenesis to occur, we can wind up in a place that's pretty good over the long term.
Yeah, I mean, City Journal had a great article on the Ford Foundation, how they it basically invented the category of Hispanic in the
Hmm.
'60s and funded a
Yeah,
bunch of programs. And those, you had these social scientists speaking to Mexican Americans who were sort of offended at the notion that they weren't white and that they were discriminated
yeah,
against and that they should have grievances
right.
against the prevailing orthodoxy. I mean, the reason why I like this so much is, from my perspective as a BIPOC, um, I, joking aside, from a sort of Latin Catholic European background, it's extremely obvious that America is a nation of Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture.
Yeah,
And the story of America is of a particular group of people with a very specific ethnic and cultural and religious and geographic origin, founding a country based on their ideas and culture, and then joining, you know, assimilating other people to that core identity. And so, you know, you want to keep both. You want to keep both things. You want to keep the sense of assimilation and the sense that people can join under conditions, of course, and the sense of historical continuity with a real historical past, which is how you get a real nation and not, a pseudo nation that's a shopping mall.
yeah,
Um, so I think it's great. It also happens to be a funny phrase.
yeah.
Um, and it's also, it's also an optimistic end to a book, 9/10 of which are sadly pessimistic.
Yeah.
Okay, so we end all our interviews with a special question, which is recommend a book that's not in your area of expertise. Can be anything, fiction, nonfiction, contemporary, old, just not in your area of expertise.
Ah, okay. Because you are a Latinx Catholic, I'm going to have to go with The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene, which
Ooh,
is
great choice.
which is one of the great Catholic novels. And in fact, it's such a good Catholic novel that I got permission to not quite teach it, but lead a multi-week discussion about it in a small group that I lead in my very reformed non-Catholic church. I went to the ministers. I said, I just want to be sure that you're okay with this because it's very Catholic, but it's more than that. It's a great Christian novel. That has with Catholic characteristics, right? So
Yes.
if you haven't read it, I mean, it was on Time Magazine's 100 greatest novels of the
Yeah,
20th century.
it's
So
a classic.
it's a classic. It's a great novel about kind of what it means to lead the Christian life and redemption of sinful people.
Yeah.
And it's very much outside my expertise, but it's a book that I really love. I love all of Graham Greene's stuff, but that
It's
one in
it's
particular.
great. It's a great pick. All right. Well, Jeremy Carl, thank you so much for your time. It's a great book. I hope people buy it, and as I say, I hope they actually read it because it's the kind of book that rewards actually reading, not just skimming, or just getting the general gist. And I'm happy we can end on this note of optimism. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure.
Bye.